I got here, it was the tail end of COVID, so they were still checking documentation. As I stepped off the plane and into the passport control, I suppose, for want of a better term, the person who was on duty took one look at my travel documents, saw the Kinley surname, and he just said to me, "Welcome home." And that was actually the first indication that, I'd come home.
That's Justin Kinley Adkins, a South African who's been living on the Isle of Man for 3 years now. He's recently found out that he's also got Manx links dating back to hundreds of years. Take a listen to his story.
I did grow up in South Africa. I do have a South African passport, but I also have a British passport, and that was from birth. It's not through naturalization. I remember from when I was very young, my great-grandmother, who was Manx, I remember sitting on her lap. I remember her talking to me, and I distinctly remember the accent, as young as I was. This was always something that stuck with me. I knew of my Manx heritage, and I knew of the extended family, but never met any of them. I knew the family names. That's as far as it went. However, my aunt, who is in South Africa at the moment, also in the process of immigrating, she has uncovered a lot more detail. And one of the interesting facts that came out, the youngest of my great-grandmother's generation was a young boy. I think he was 4 years old when he passed here on the Isle. His name was Cecil Kinley, and he passed away in 1904. It was quite a tragic passing because he tripped and fell in Braddon Cemetery and knocked his head and then passed away a few days later. And what happened was the family was so overwhelmed by the grief that they wanted to move away. Now, obviously, the island is not a massive place, so if you want to move away, you generally will leave. And that's exactly what happened, because a lot of their compatriots at the time were miners, and they were leaving to the South African gold and diamond fields. I think there's a lot of families from the Milcreasts, or the one family that I know that also moved over. The Corlett. In fact, Corlett Drive is named after the Corlett family in Johannesburg. So there's already the Manx connection there. Anyway, long story short, the family left. They were actively involved with the Manx community in South Africa. And in fact, my great-grandmother, although she got married in South Africa, she got married to a Manxman as well.
Right. Now, there was lots of information there. So let's unpack it. Let's start with your gran first. Do you remember her name?
She was just my nana.
Oh, sorry, your great-gran.
Yes.
Right.
I remember her as Nana. I do have the information. I'd have to look it up, but offhand, I don't. But I do know that she was a Kinley.
Right. And did she ever speak about the Isle of Man? Growing up, did you hear the words Isle of Man or Manx?
All the time. In fact, my mom's family was very proud of the fact that they were Manx. Even my grandfather, although he was born in South Africa, he was the first person to drop into a conversation that he was Manx. And coming back to the Isle, it was quite an eye-opener for me, because I didn't realize how Manx he was, because he was just my grandfather, until I got back here. Walking around, I often see people with similar features, and the thought crosses my mind, is it a distant relative? Chances are it is, particularly if the family is either a Kinley or Corlett. I think there was also the Bells and Bonnets were also not massive names, I don't think, on the island, but that's the family connections there.
Just before we finish off on your gran, you also told me off mic a very interesting story about a very special piece of jewelry of your great-gran.
Yes. My great-grandmother's diamond came back to the island, because that was gifted to her. She used that in her, I'm not sure if it was the wedding ring or if it was the engagement ring. And you must remember, this was the early 1900s, so it wasn't as common practice, from what I understand, with diamonds. However, my grandmother gave them to me, and I had a wedding ring made for my wife, and those diamonds came back to the island with the family.
So full circle there.
Yeah, look, for me, it's been a journey, and I said to you off mic as well, I actually feel more at home here. It's probably partly with my upbringing. I did have quite a more Manx and UK upbringing, even though I was born and grew up in South Africa. My father's a Brummie, my mom's definitely, if you look at my mom, again, you can see she's the Manx connection is there.
Right. Now, going back to tracing the roots, the Isle of Man roots, were you in the process, or were your family in the process of tracing that before you moved over, or did that all start when you or after you moved over?
My aunt has always had, this is my mom's sister, Laureen, she's always had an interest in genealogy. So there was, to some degree, a bit of knowledge, but it certainly wasn't as extensive as what it is now. She's traced a lot of the family back, well, a couple of generations now on the island. In fact, from my mom's side, our history so far on the island is much longer than any of the history in South Africa.
And when you did decide to move to the Isle of Man, was this, knowing this information, was that one of the reasons why you were looking at the island? Or at that time, did you know this information?
I didn't. There was hearsay, and there were discussions that had happened over dinner over the years that I remember. But the Isle of Man was always a place that I wanted to visit purely because of the family connection. But I didn't realize, again, how deep it was until I got here. I do think my aunt probably did a little bit more research after we got here. Her daughter, Nikki, my cousin, she's been over to visit. My eldest daughter is now also moved here. She's in her mid-20s. So slowly but surely the family, if they're not returning, they're at least visiting again.
And how does that make you feel, knowing that you've traced family back to the early 1900s and here you are, you're here, you've got family members coming over, visiting, seeing the Isle of Man, does that kind of take you full circle?
It does. I'm not an overly emotional person, but I think where it first hit home is when I got the notification that Cecil's grave had been found. And I actually went during the course of this week to the grave. Again, I'm not even a very religious person, but I did say a few words. And the most important thing I felt to convey to, if there's a spirit or whatever that is there, is the fact that his family has returned, because for 120 years there has been no direct family member on the island until we returned. I seriously doubt anybody's visited the grave. I'm going to take the rest of my family back, and we're going to take some flowers, and I think I'll probably make a fairly regular visit to the New Braddon Cemetery.
Now you've got all of this information. Where to from now?
Delve a bit deeper, because it's just the tip of the iceberg. We're well into the 1800s. From a conversation that I had, I think we can even trace it further back to the 1700s. But I'm on the island now, so all the records are here. Now that I've been pointed in the right direction by my aunt, I can literally go to the Manx Museum. They've got all this information. What I also want to do is I do want to go visit some of the places where the family, well, not just buried, but also where the churches where they were married, because most of them still exist. Some of the houses where they lived, because they still exist. In fact, my aunt has provided us with a couple of the details of the cottages where they were living in before they left. So I have been onto Google Earth. I have confirmed that it does indeed still exist. I'm not going to go knock on the door and ask to go in. That would be a bit creepy. But I'm certainly going to go and retrace the footsteps of my ancestors.
We know the past, right? In terms of present, have you managed to reach out to any possible relatives? Would you be looking to do something like that?
I would love to. Again, through conversations with my aunt, I do believe that we do have family on the island still. I don't know who they are, but it would be great to meet them. It's not a massive island, but the fact that the Kinleys and the Corlets and the Bells and the Barnets still have family here, well, certainly the Kinleys and the Corlets, there's a lot of them. I guarantee you at least a handful I would be related to, because although my great-grandmother's family left, there would have been cousins that didn't. So they are definitely going to still be on the island, or if they're not on the island, they might themselves have family that would be even distantly related to me. So yes, to answer your question, I would love to meet up with anybody that I'm related to.
In terms of your ancestors, that family that left in the early 1900s, any idea what they did on the island? And when they moved over to South Africa, I know you said they moved over with the mining community. Did they then get into mining? Any idea?
They didn't actually. I know my great-great-grandmother was a housekeeper. She always used to refer to it as the big house. I don't know which house it was, but it must have been one of the estates. She was the housekeeper there. And her husband was the coachman. When they moved to South Africa, I'm not sure what she did. However, I do know that the coachman became a coachmaker. And they were up in Johannesburg at that time. So with the boom in mining, he probably had a booming business, which also explains why he could afford a diamond for when his daughter got married, because I believe he's the one that purchased it.
Wendy Thirkettle is an archivist at Manx National Heritage. She told me while one of the big topics over the last few years has been inward migration to the Isle of Man, decades ago, Manx families were leaving the island. Have a listen to what Wendy's got to say, and also have a listen to some of the gems that's stored at the Manx Museum. We often hear about inward migration, lots of South Africans moving over to the Isle of Man. But I understand the history between the Isle of Man and South Africa dates back to hundreds, if not thousands of years.
We can go with the documentation that we have, and it's particularly strong from the 19th century onwards, so the 1800s. And one particular person which many people on the island might have heard about was Joseph Milquist, known as the Diamond King, because he went out to South Africa to seek his fortune, and unlike some, he succeeded.
Why is it that there were Manx families moving out of the island?
Lots of reasons. Often economic, so maybe going where the work was. In particular, mining. So you would have people both coming into the island and moving out. So we had Cornish miners working in Laxey. We had Manx miners moving out to North America and then also to South Africa. They were highly skilled and work might have dried up, or they saw that they could make a better opportunity overseas. So mining in particular, but not just that. There would be mariners, people maybe sailing out by merchant boats as well, and travelling the world and calling in at various ports in South Africa.
Now, in terms of these miners, I understand they did set up a Manx mining community. But do we have any records that show if some of these people returned back to the island?
In the Transvaal, there was a Manx association, and we're really lucky that those minute books and such like have been deposited with us. And within that, you might get news of going toing and froing. We don't hold the kind of passenger lists, which are seen as a bit of the holy grail of giving people's movements, but we can find certain stories out through correspondence and people's journals as to their movements, both out to South Africa and then later coming back.
We're in the year 2024. All of this took place in the 1900s, early 1900s. How valuable is it when you find these links, or when people approach you and say, actually, I think I have a link, or I've got this book that may be of value to you?
Well, as an archivist, I'm totally biased because my love and focus is on original documentation from which people can draw knowledge and interpret and then tell histories. And without the original documentation, things are compromised because there's a danger of trying to make it up or join up dots which don't make an accurate story. So in particular, I love things like diaries and memoirs, journals, original correspondence, and these help piece the story. And it may be even personal papers. Content is arriving all the time, and there's I was looking recently to see what has come in about South Africa, and there's been some fantastic content, including in the last 6 weeks or so, a transcription of what's called the Boer War Diary of a Daniel Farger Corlett. And that's been put together by the family for family circulation, but we have a copy. And the actual original diary was found in the attic of his old home in Balaf. And I suppose that's, number one, it's wonderful that we hold the resource, but it shows that some content is at risk because sometimes maybe people don't recognise what they're sitting on. So I would say if you maybe have something that you'd like us to consider, not just with South African links, we'd love to have the chance to have a look and see whether it's relevant for our collections.
If I can go back to Daniel Corlett. So did he, what do we know about him? Did he then travel to South Africa, fight in the Boer War, return back and brought his diary back with him, and that's how the family would have found it? Any idea?
Well, let's see. So we know that he departed from the Isle of Man, and the diary charts his journey and his Boer War experiences from 1897 to 1900. Yeah, it can be a bit tricky as to knowing exactly how the original got back to the island, but it's wonderful that it did. And of course, not everyone did come back. Some people settled and they made a life out there, and others, including miners, might have had fatal accidents. We know of that. You know, it was a very dangerous line of work. So, yep, sometimes it's not clear, sometimes it is clear. And we're forever, as I say, receiving new content. So we had papers, for instance, of a Reverend Robert Daniel Kermode, who was a clergyman on the island at Macclesfield, St George's, Douglas, and latterly at Lezayre. And we knew quite a lot about him because he was an antiquarian. He wrote about Lezayre, and we have his papers. But only in the last couple of years did something be deposited which showed that he was basically a chaplain on a hospital ship. And we have a notification, authorisation from the War Office in 1900, authorising him to be an acting chaplain, to head out on a ship proceeding to Cape Town, returning thence with sick and wounded troop. You'll be paid at a rate of 10 shillings a day while on board ship, and you'll be provided with free passage, with free messing, exclusive of wines, brackets, whilst on board. That's really interesting because I didn't know that he had a connection, and he took a particular interest in the First World War men of his parish of St George's who went out on active service. He actually kept tabs on them, and knowing that he had actually served in that Boer War campaign throws extra light on his career.
And I understand there were quite a few Manxmen or men from the Isle of Man that actually headed to South Africa and also participated in the war.
Yeah, absolutely. The original is held at the University of South Africa, but we have an amazing diary survives, a Transvaal war diary of Lieutenant Douglas Howard Gill. He served with the Royal Horse Artillery and the Royal Field Artillery and was part of the siege of Ladysmith, and he was severely wounded in the war. He goes into great detail. It's actually quite hard reading, really vivid. He describes each battle with statistics of men killed, wounded or taken prisoner, and basically the death and sickness all around, and the wretchedness of want and the food. Those are his words.
You've just shared 3 different individuals and their stories with me. I mean, I'm sure you've got a vast number of others, but this goes back to, I think, the question I asked earlier about how important is it, when you get these finds, how important is it that we all just preserve our history?
That's a big question. The thing is, we can't keep everything. It's for our collecting remit is to document the Isle of Man and to find stories about individuals which really enhance our knowledge of particular things. And the island's history is so varied. And sometimes it can be that people can make use of their own papers and they can interpret them, and they can do their own research to tell that story into a finished result. We've got one good example of someone who did an academic dissertation in creative writing at the University of Cape Town, and she traced the history of her great-grandfather, William Cageen, who was a miner, and he went to the tin mines of Cornwall and silver mines in Colorado before arriving in the Transvaal. So we haven't got, if you like, the papers, but we've got her understanding and her searching to tell the story, which included coming to the Isle of Man for her studies, and that makes for a really, really useful resource. So not everyone's got necessarily a book in them, but I suppose what I'd really love to encourage people is just not to dismiss things, especially if it's things that aren't necessarily directly connected to you. It might be that a relative's stored something in a basement or an attic, and it might be of particular interest to the family, but it could help tell the story of, say, a Manx company or a business or a society that's closed down.
Have you noticed more people coming over to the island, trying to trace or track their ancestry? And what could be the reason behind people wanting to find that identity?
So people can try and do things online, but actually coming to the physical place, I think, is really quite significant. It's almost like a pilgrimage, I think, for some people, because it's loaded with finding maybe the parish on the island that people were connected to, finding landmarks, maybe even a family home, a farm, and getting a sense of place. That's a phrase which is used quite often, but I think it's significant. It's making the connections, but also actually being in the surroundings. It can help settle, and it can help stir and want people to maybe find out more. So we've always had people come to our library to do family history. It's a big part of how we serve people, and some people do come and they come again and again, and others it's a trip of a lifetime if they're coming from a long way. So we know that it's going to be steeped in a lot of meaning for them.
Now, if anyone were to come or visit the Manx Museum, they'd be introduced to you. What's the process then? Would you be able to kind of help them or assist them along the way if there is anything in the archives?
Yep, that's how we try to do it. People can give us advance notice of coming over by emailing us at library@mnh.im. We'll try and steer them. We can't do the research on their behalf, otherwise we'd be tying ourselves up in knots, and we're quite a small team. But yeah, we can use our local knowledge. There's a very active Isle of Man Family History Society for people who need assistance that way, and people pay a subscription and get a lot of extra help that way. There's information on our Manx National Heritage website too, giving tips towards family history. We always say, keep your expectations modest, so that you're not going to be just so that you can find out bits and pieces. And if you get stuck, there are people on the island who can do research for a fee as well, and use their knowledge of the sources to help maybe get you over that sticky bit.